So the first thing any artist should get when they're doing watercolor is some quality watercolor paper. It's heavy so that it won't rip. I also tape down my edges so there won't be any buckling. You can do this on a board or on a table. I use this brand called Mia for my watercolors. I think it's just a really cute kit, and it folds up and you can take it on the go in case you want to go on a hike and go watercoloring and be an artist somewhere. Another cool kit, everybody knows it, that Crayola watercolor kit. This one actually comes with a pretty nice brush considering the price of, Crayola watercolors. Yeah, the only difference you're probably going to see in Crayola versus another kit is the saturation or how pigmented it is. So depending on the price range of the watercolors, you're going to find different quality. So next we'll talk about brushes. I use just varying sizes and styles of brushes. I use a synthetic brush. These brushes are really cool. They are a synthetic tip, but the back opens up and you have this little water reservoir that you can fill up. So it's kind of that sense of the to-go watercolor like I was talking about earlier. So you could take this out with you on like a little hike or a walk, and you'd already have water ready to go in your brush. They come in varying sizes, so they're fun to work with. I might work with them today, but I think all these brushes are great. Depending on the shape of the brush, of course, it's going to give you different ways to work in your piece. When you're doing large areas, use a larger brush. I mean, just kind of use what makes sense to you at the time. That's all that you really need to think about. Alright, so when I'm at home, I traditionally like to use two different water cups. One is for my dirty water, one is for my clean water, and so it'll kind of protect you from getting a bunch of muddy color onto your piece when you clean out your brush and your dirty water, and then use your clean water to actually apply to your piece. Another tool that I like to have on hand is a straw, and we'll go over how I use this in a few minutes. Make sure that you have some paper towel along with any brush that you use so that you can make sure that your brush is clean to work with at all times, and also make sure that your brush isn't too wet when you're working in certain areas. Alright, I think I'm about prepared. We're going to walk through some general techniques for watercolor. The first technique is going to be called dry brushing. So it's kind of difficult to get a dry brush technique with dry watercolor blocks like we're using. So if you have a liquid watercolor, this will get a better result for you. The first thing that you're going to do is you are going to get your brush and get it just a little bit wet. You don't want it to get too wet because it's a dry brush, or it's supposed to be a dry brush. This technique is going to get you a little bit more on the textured side, so get your brush a little bit wet and build up some paint on the surface. Pat it off. You want to make sure that your brush is moderately dry for this one. It's really hard to get with a block because you need to have water to wet your brush. So I'm going to do one equal wash first, and now I'm going to try to kick up some texture on the top. So what you'll get is a very textured surface that's kind of layered up, and I just wanted you to know that this is an option for your piece. The next technique we are going to be learning is called wet on dry, and it's just another way to start working into your piece using watercolor on a dry surface. So I'm going to grab my brush and get some water onto my brush. I'm of course using my clean water, and I'm going to use my Mia watercolor pack. This is the olive green color that is in that packet. I'm going to add a little bit more water, and this is simply just a blocking of color using the wet on dry technique. So it's very simple: wet brush, dry paper, wet on dry. Very, very simple. Now, one of the interesting things that you can do when you have wet paint on a dry watercolor sheet is you can take a brush that has nothing on it and brush away some of the paint. So if you wanted to have a lighter area in your piece, you can pull up some of that paint by simply using a clean, dry brush. Your paint still has to be wet for you to be able to pull it up, but it's a really useful technique. Now because I'm extra, I have a little heat gun. I don't like to use hair dryers because they tend to blow the paint around, but if you use a little heat gun, your piece can dry that much faster. Now I'm just going to do one layer of blue on the top to kind of emphasize that white area. Alright, so this is the result of wet on dry with a little bit of negative space pulled out with a dry brush. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, it's wet paint. It goes on a dry surface. Duh. But there is a technique that is specific to watercolor as well called wet on wet. So there's different ways to tackle the surface of your piece. So the first thing that I'm going to do when I prepare for wet on wet is take my surface and get it wet first. I like to build up a lot of moisture on the surface. I'm going to take some green Crayola watercolor and build into this area by adding wet paint. And it's such an interesting effect when you add wet paint to a wet surface because it kind of like creates this cloudy effect to it. I'm going to be using red and green and try to get a little mix of interesting coloration here, mixing them and adding a little bit more water as I go to blend and kind of just have fun. Wet on wet technique is also another reason why we want to make sure that we have good watercolor paper that's heavy, at least a little bit, to make sure that you can re-wet areas and redevelop areas. Because with a normal piece of paper, it's going to rip. So please make sure you invest even in just like Canson watercolor paper. That's great. You can get it at Walmart. One of the beautiful things about watercolor is if your paint is still wet and you made a mistake, you can take a little piece of paper towel or a dry brush and pat onto your wet area and pull up some of that paint. And then when it dries down, that paint in that area will be much lighter. Alright, this is our wet on wet. As you can see, it's a little bit different looking than our wet on dry. It kind of bleeds together a little bit more and gets that drippy look. You can also see where I pulled up the paint with that piece of paper towel earlier. This is the first technical term you need to know in watercolor, and it's called a flat wash. A flat wash is the term for an even blocking of color, and you can either do that with wet on wet or wet on dry, whichever one is the most comfortable to you or gets the effect that you want the most. So I'm going to use a wet on dry technique because I find it more comfortable, and I'm going to use a flat, wide, straight brush just to make sure that I have those crispy, flat lines, and then I'm going to just create an even, flat wash of color. So for this flat wash, I want it to be a little bit more intense and saturated in color, so I'm going to dry my paint and then I'm going to wash over it with another layer of color. It's important to remember when you're working with watercolor that it is about layering to get that darkness and not trying to rush in and blop it all on the very first layer that you do. If you do that, sometimes it'll end up uneven and you'll have to just rewash over it anyways. So take your time and do multiple washes to get an even and intense color. Alright, now we're going to be stepping it up in technical complexity and we're going to be doing a graded wash. Now, this is a little bit more difficult, so you have to make sure that you remain patient with yourself and take your time. So a graded wash just refers to a single color that ranges from dark to light in any given direction. So the first thing I'm going to do is build up some paint. So I need to start with a general flat wash first, just to get some color onto my piece. And I'm kind of going to be using a wet on wet technique to blend my dark to my light. Alright, so now I'll be adding some of my other purple just because I want to try out the difference in saturation and pigment. I'm going to add a little bit more paint there, and I'm going to be using the wet on wet style to not only put in the paint, I'm going to use it to blend it out. So I pat it off my brush, and now I'm kind of blending it between that range there. I want it to be a bit more dynamic, so I'm going to go in once I let it dry and darken up that dark. So as you can see here, I pat off my brush to use my dry brush to manipulate the wet paint just a little bit more to get it in these places that I really want it to be, that dark to medium to light. So this is our graded wash. It ranges from a saturated dark purple to that light lilac purple on the bottom. Alright, we're going to step it up again in technical difficulty, and we are going to be doing a variegated wash. And a variegated wash just refers to a wash that has been variegated in color. So you're going to be doing one color to another color and kind of blending them together, just like a sunset would look, or any kind of shift from one color to the next. So we're going to work this wet on dry first and lay down one flat wash of color on the top. And then I'm going to clean my brush out pretty thoroughly, make sure that it's really well cleaned, and I'm going to lay out my other color on the bottom, make sure I even it out. Maybe lay in a little bit more color there. So now I'm going to work on it like a wet on wet and lay in more color and then blend back and forth from one color to the next until I get the kind of range that I'm looking for and the blend that I'm looking for. Looks like I made a little boo-boo. So I'm going to take a little paper towel and just pat it. It's really important if you make a mistake that you pat instead of scrub or kind of brush it back and forth, because if you brush it back and forth, it could tear up your paper a little bit. It looks like I got a little bit of water on my flat wash too. Oh no! So I'm going to pat those off and clean those up. So this is our variegated wash. The range from one color to the next, and you get that really beautiful sunset look. So the next technique, we're going to actually need to use some tape. I like to use washi tape, but you can use painter's tape. Just be careful that you don't pull too hard and rip your paper up. So what you're going to do is you are going to lay down your tape in some various shape. This I like to call negative space. And I like to call it that because the washi tape or the tape that you lay down can leave a white negative space. So I'm going to lay down some color, any color, just kind of plop it in there and get some bursts of color happening in there. You can do wet on wet or wet on dry, just kind of go crazy. So this one, it's very important that you let it dry. So let it dry and then start removing your tape, and you'll see that you have some really nice crispy edges left behind and some very sharp shapes that are happening here. So this is a close-up. Unfortunately, I took this picture right after I made a mistake and got some orange on my piece, but it serves the same purpose. You can see all the sharp lines that are created by the tape. The next technique we'll be doing is called glazing, and glazing refers to layering up your watercolor in translucent layers so you can see underneath. Kind of similarly to a glazed donut, you can see underneath the icing layer to the donut beneath, and it kind of tinges the donut a certain frosted white color. So that's what we'll be doing with glazing here. We are going to lay down lines of watercolor, and then we're going to let it completely dry, and then layer up more transparent layers on the top so that they're not truly blending together, just kind of creating layers on top of one another and tinting each other. For the next technique, we're going to kind of play around with a little bit more abstract and loose style. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work with wet on wet. So we are going to get the area of our paper very, very wet. I like to use a big square for this one because we're going to be using a lot of space just to have some fun. Now I'm going to grab some color with my brush and lay it into my wet area that I just created. I'm just going to blop down color. Lots of water, lots of color, so we're going to work and play around with wet on wet. Now it is time to grab my trusty straw and blow all of the paint that I just built up and create a really weird and interesting texture. Kind of just go for it. Of course, if you're doing this on a piece that you really care about and you're trying to protect an area, please block it off with tape or with a paper or something. Protect your other area. So I'm just going to re-wet my area and go in for another layer after I let it dry and just kind of have fun with it. See, this is why I tell you, protect your area and then pat it off if you make a mistake. So I would use this technique as a means to create an interesting or fun background for my piece, and then kind of layer over the top by glazing. So last but not least, we are going to learn how to do a splatter. So I'm going to apply some paint onto my brush, and then I'm going to use this technique to kind of flick the bristles towards my piece. If you're really gentle, this is okay for your brushes, but of course you want to be gentle on a brush so it doesn't get all splayed out and nasty after one use. On the left you can see where my paper was wet, so it kind of created a blotchy, cloudy look, and on the right you can tell where it was dry and created a more fine, sprinkling, speckled kind of look. So you can decide if you want to use it wet on wet or wet on dry. Either way, it's a really cool effect to use.